the ethics of self. And the basis for this is we've all been exposed to the idea of the use of self as being a clinical tool. And there are some ethical considerations when we do that. To address those, what we want to do is start by defining what use of self means. And then I'll introduce a conceptualization that I use, the head formula, as a way to effectively apply use of self. And then also, as a kind of a subtopic of that, to make countertransference your friend. Instead of the big bugaboo that many of us have come to think of it as, countertransference actually is a source of support that can be used very productively. Okay, on to definitions of use of self. Did a little bit of looking. There's about 25 different variations of how.
Dave, we can't see your slides.
Oh my goodness. I wonder why not.
Let's try going through that share screen.
Oh,
stuff again.
Yes. Guess what I forgot to do?
That's okay. You were just as excited as we were to dive in.
Okay, can you see it now?
Yep, perfect. Thank you.
All right, you're welcome. Again, my apologies. Let me back up to talk about our goals for today. All right, so I want to define what use of self is and want to introduce what I call the head formula, technique strategy that I've used to effectively apply self, how we use ourselves to be a benefit to our clients. And then also kind of a subtopic of that, making what I call countertransference your friend, how to use the energy of that in a therapeutically productive way. One of the things for us to remember, of course, is that use of self is not limited to social workers. Let's talk about some definitions. This was as I looked through the literature for various definitions, this was the one that seemed to be the most comprehensive for me and kind of tied a bunch of different things together. I did think it was a little bit wordy, and so I came up with my own definition. Use of self is use what you know, use who you are, and do it in the service of others. And as alluded to earlier, use of self is not limited to social workers. You can see in this emergency worker's face how herself is part of her work. All right, to kind of get into that a little bit, I haven't given you my background yet because my background is part of myself. And this is my, what I call my knowledge, values, and skills part of the definition, use of self. This is the things that you will see, the types of things that you'll see on any kind of curriculum vitae, application, speaker introduction, etc. You know, pretty straightforward, pretty objective. This is my awareness of who I am, self, however. My spirituality has been central to how I experience myself in the world for a long, long time. Being a husband, father, grandfather, a real central part of who I am. Having a disability is an experience that has shaped a big part of my life. I could not survive without fishing. I have a bunch of traits, a bunch of experiences. Many of them are treasured, and some, frankly, are not. I'm aware of being an old, straight white guy, and that after 40 years of doing this, I am still not fully aware of myself. I am, however, aware of my sense of humor. I'm assuming I'm hearing some groaning in the background. Thank you very much. Okay, the point that I would really like to emphasize is that all of these parts of ourself, treasured, not treasured, obvious, not obvious, conscious, not conscious, they can all be used to be a benefit, and they can all be a detriment. The difference is using your head, sense of humility, knowledge of our ethical principles, awareness of self and of others, and discipline, the decision to use them and taking the steps necessary to do so. When all of those things are present, our self becomes a source of great benefit to our clients. So we're going to go through each of these briefly and give you some ideas of what they all mean. And 1 second to it, please. There we go. I'm just learning the technology of pop-ups. Anyway, let's start with humility. This is my favorite definition that I've come across. Humility is not thinking, oh, I'm not very good, I'm this kind of less than thing, that kind of less than thing. Humility is just having an accurate picture of who we are. On the right, that Japanese phrase, Oshiete kurite aigado, I think is how it's pronounced. We're going to come back to that in this context. Humility includes being willing to learn from anyone, especially our clients. A saying that is, I believe, attributed to Confucius. The wise learn more from fools than fools learn from the wise. Humility involves making a conscious decision for curiosity over defensiveness. You have a reaction to something. Instead of trying to protect, it's deciding to be open. What more can you tell me about what you just said? Become curious, and that's a conscious decision to make. And acknowledging both strengths and weaknesses. Again, I think that us social workers, by and large, are willing to acknowledge, at least to ourselves, our weaknesses. We need to acknowledge our strengths as well. What are things that we know that we do well? What are some things, as well as some things that we wish we could do better? Both will always be present from now until the day we die. And then developing an attitude of gratitude. This is where Oshiete kurite aigado comes in. I think I pronounced that right. That is what a karate student will say after class, after a training session in a dojo. The training session consists of the instructor, the sensei, and other students hitting each other, kicking each other, throwing each other around, being bruised, being sore. After which, they all stand up in a circle, bow in, and say, Oshiete kurite aigado, which is Japanese for thank you for teaching me. And that's an attitude. Discomfort can and is often a very, very good teacher if we allow it to be so. The NASW Code of Ethics has something to say about use of self as well. We elevate service of others above self-interest, which, as I suggest to you, we have an ethical obligation, of course, to manage countertransference. We need to be sure that we are there for others and not ourselves, or at least others more than ourselves. I hesitated there because I had to realize that there's no way that we're not in this somewhat for self. We get a sense of reward. That's a self-benefit. But that self-benefit always needs to be subordinated. The idea of dignity and worth of the person, being aware of differences and diversity. We're obligated to acknowledge what we don't know and what our clients do know about them and about their background. And when we do acknowledge that, again, we're more open to asking appropriate questions to get information, which is also empowering for folks along the way. Engaging people as partners. A lot easier to engage with someone if you have enough of an idea of who they are, so you know who you're dealing with. Our clients do need to have some feel of us as human beings. And the idea of integrity, again, this goes back to the countertransference idea. Taking care of yourself professionally and personally is an ethical obligation that we have to our clients. If we're not taking care of ourselves, we are coming short of the ethical principles from our code of ethics. And the whole idea of competency. We all know that the idea of learning never ends, and using your head is a never-ending process. It goes on for as long as you practice, along with all the other things that we learn. Okay, let's move on to talking about awareness. That just means knowing the stuff that is you. What makes Dave Ware Dave Ware? What makes Danielle Haskins Danielle Haskins, etc. Personal traits and tendencies. Back again to the idea of the ones that you like and the ones that you don't. I think we can always come up with lists of things that we like about ourselves, lists of things that we don't like about ourselves. Kind of the trick there is to view both of those and still recognize our dignity and worth while we're doing so. But being aware of those is important. Also, just the simple demographics. Whatever your age is, whatever your race, cultural background is, what your gender is, what your relationship status is, all those things have an impact on you. And all those things have an impact on how we understand others. And back again to the idea of personal experiences and memories, painful and otherwise. We are, I think, aware that we need to be conscious of when whatever a client is sharing or whatever an interaction triggers something for us that's hurtful and that feels painful. And we need to note our reactions to that. It goes the other way too. If I'm not paying attention and a client of mine brings up either fishing or kayaking, I can go off. So the things that we like about ourselves, the things that we value about ourselves, we need to be conscious of how we utilize those as well. Beliefs, values, and their hierarchies. Again, what we believe to be true, the things we value, obviously impact what we do, obviously impact who we are. But the idea of hierarchy is important too. Not all values are created equal. And sometimes there are things that, as I put it, this is a hill to die on. There are some things that for me are so important that if I were told, look, for me to work with you, you need to say or believe this, I have to say, no, I'm sorry, I can't. There's some wiggle room. Some and I think we all are open to negotiating. Some don't matter enough to even mention. I come from a religious tradition that has kind of various denominations, connections to them. I frankly don't care where someone else is coming from in terms of their spirituality, either if it's within my overall tradition or if it's outside of it. And that is something that can certainly be flexible, but then does tie back to things that, that will touch on beliefs that I need to be clear with something I can't let go of. But there's always interaction. There's always, again, hierarchies where we go from one to another. This I'm not willing to change. This can be flexible on how it interacts. This, I simply do not care much about one way or another. Because this all interacts with the stuff that is our clients, their traits and tendencies, their demographics, et cetera, et cetera. It's an interlocking set of awarenesses. Which brings us to the point of discipline. We need to put together what you know. We need to put together what we know about ourselves, what we know and are learning about our clients. And we use that interaction to decide what to do, what not to do, and why. What is behind this decision? And then we observe the outcome. For those of you who are familiar with the whole dialectical behavioral therapy paradigm, this is the observing, and other contexts. So this is the observing ego. We detach ourselves from ourselves to some extent, as much as we can. Observe the outcome. Then we refine, both in the moment and then we repeat. And again, I want to emphasize that this is a lifelong process. Okay, excuse me one moment. Thank you. Okay, the use of self has, of course, a few parts to it. And for the sake of time, I wanted to simplify it down into these two. The idea of self-awareness and self-disclosure. Self-awareness is pretty straightforward. It's what you know about you. But there's a dual consciousness. Self-awareness is always going to be there to some extent. But when you're interacting with a client, it's usually going to be running in the background. It's not going to be the forefront of your consciousness. However, sometimes it does need to come into the foreground, and that's a skill that is something that one develops. Okay, when do I start paying more attention to, at least in the moment, to what I am experiencing and who I am versus the client. Self-disclosure, obviously, is what you say about you. And here the dual consciousness is even more important, because when we are talking about ourselves, that's gonna trail into things that no matter how self-aware we are, we can be a little bit surprised. So we need to discipline our self-awareness so we can maintain an awareness of the client as well. Now, the frequency of self-disclosures will vary from one client to another, and will also vary between sessions. This particular interaction of myself and client self may call for maybe a little bit more self-disclosure. This may be a little less. And the factors that are involved in that can vary greatly. Just real quick, I work a lot with folks that have chronic and progressive illnesses. And because we have that great shared common background, a relatively high amount of self-disclosure I have found to be helpful for them. Other situations, it's much more individual. It's typically much less. But also from one session to another, even for a chronically ill client. The frequency of my self-disclosures will vary greatly. When doing so, however, here's a rule of thumb. When you talk about yourself, as simple and short as possible. The longer you start talking about yourself, the greater the likelihood that your disclosure is varying from client interest to self-interest. Okay, so the types of, I'm talking about the types of self-disclosures. The deer in the headlight situation. Okay, they're seeing me. What do I talk about? First type, the here and now. That's talking about your reactions, your thoughts about the client and about the session. And that loads on the value of transparency and genuineness. If you're having a reaction, it very likely is going to be observable to your client, and it therefore may be in the best interest of the client to share something about that. There and then disclosure, that's discussion about you about your life outside the session. When I talk about anything about my family, my spiritual traditions, my love of the outdoors, that's about me. That's about, of course, outside the session. The motivator to use that is going to still be one of, okay, what can I share? What can I and should I share about myself to help support the idea of competency and sensitivity across cultural lines? Usually, again, rules of thumb, here and now self-disclosure is going to be more helpful than there and then, because what it does is capitalize on the therapeutic relationship, the experience in the moment. However, both do have their place. It can, in fact, be very important to do some there and then disclosing. Excuse me again. Thank you. And both will manifest countertransference. At least that is my belief. That could be a topic we want to talk about when we have our Q&A time in about 10 minutes. Okay, countertransference. If we were in person, I'd be asking how many of you have either observed or I should say, seen episodes of Star Trek: The Next Generation. The reason it's called The Next Generation is it came out after the original Star Trek, which is the Star Trek that I grew up on. The Next Generation now, I believe, is a generation older than many people who are viewing this. But now you've just seen how my countertransference in terms of being aware of my age has just come into play. So with that as a background, from Star Trek: The Next Generation comes the phrase, resistance is futile. When this particular alien race comes to take over a planet, they say, resistance is futile. You cannot stop us. As with the Borg, which is the name of that alien race, countertransference, I believe, is always present. Our self never goes away. The good news is you can and ethically should, and fortunately have the ability to decide how to use it. Call it clinical judo. Judo is based on using the strength and force of your opponent to control their behavior. So we use the strength of countertransference to help us decide, discipline what we do. Do we disclose? If so, what do we disclose, how, and why? The energy of countertransference can be directed towards thinking and reflecting on those questions, or not disclose. If we come to that conclusion, then again, similar series of reflections. Why don't I disclose? And now what do I do with this reaction instead of / in addition to disclosure? And we need to go back to the idea that whatever we decide to do, it's about the client. It's not about us. I'm feeling some anxiety right now. What is in the best interest of my client in terms of how I respond to this anxiety? Take a breath and move on. Talk about it. Regardless of the decision, afterwards, probably something to reflect on. Okay, so what tools do we have to help us do that reflection? Kind of touched on a couple of those a little bit. The references, by the way, I do have a list of references, that reference screen that will show you at the end of the presentation. And I do try to reference, cite the references as I am discussing them. Got some from the Knight reference and one that's just mine. From Knight. Is disclosure necessary for informed consent? Sometimes there are things about ourselves, and these will typically be there and then disclosures that are absolutely necessary. I had a client, someone who wanted to meet with me initially, who came from a very strict fundamental interpretation of the Holy Scriptures that we share. And she said to me, look, I believe in 7 days of creation. I believe that the flood literally covered the world. And I need to work with a therapist who believes those same things. And so I had to say, ma'am, I'm sorry, those are not my beliefs. And so we had to decide that we could not work together. If it's not necessary for informed consent, then we can also consider, okay, back to what we were alluding to earlier, who benefits from this, the client or me? And I'm going to say that any type of disclosure, that even if it's neutral, even if you firmly believe, hey, this doesn't hurt, this doesn't help, it's still best to not do it, because again, what we want is the focus to be on the client. So the decision is, okay, yeah, I think this will be a benefit to my client to say this. If I am aware that I want to say it because I'll feel better if I do, then they become a little more complicated. I'm going to talk about that in a second. The idea of, will disclosure be helpful for making progress and building the working alliance? Here's where disclosure in terms of building the working alliance, we're making progress building the working alliance. An alliance requires two people. If you in your reflection consider this disclosure of yourself to be helpful to you in terms of connecting with your client, and you have decided how you can disclose in a productive way, that can still be building the alliance, and that can be making progress. Then, of course, conversely, if this disclosure could interfere with progress in our working alliance, then it's something that, of course, we do not do, and we need to come up with other ways to deal with it. Will non-disclosure interfere? Kind of hits on the same thing. An example that I'd like to bring is not a personal example, but another therapist, tragically, their oldest child had died in an accident, and Therapist had a picture of the family on his desk that included a picture of his deceased child. And the client asked, "Oh, is that picture of your family?" And yes, it is. Well, how old are looks like it's a few years old. How old are your children now? And the therapist really had to think for a second, because the client was dealing with her own tragic deaths of someone who she knew, but the therapist is still not sure how to address it. Therapist made a decision to disclose. The client, however, was someone who was a real rescuer. She was always taking care of other people. So the therapist had to then work with how to reestablish the idea of, no, you do not need to take care of me. However, his reasons for disclosing was that she kept pushing the issue. How old are your kids? I want to know about your kids. Tell me about your kids. And so the decision that he made was, if I don't disclose, then it's going to create more of a block to the therapeutic alliance than if I do disclose. So the decision was disclose and then manage the impact of the disclosure later. Okay, so those are some of the questions that I try to keep in mind, and I submit to you for your consideration to see if they can be helpful for you as well. I like to do a case study where this is an experience that I have recently, and because I know that if I talk too long, I start talking too fast, I'm just going to give you folks a minute to read that brief synopsis. And while you're doing that, describe my bad day approach. With agency knowledge and support, a bad day is, I'll say to a client for the first time that they miss a session and don't provide notification. And bear in mind, they've already signed the fee agreement, so they know the agency policy right up front. I will always say to someone on the first occasion, hey, look, everyone has a bad day. We forget things, we're human, so we're not going to charge. But I do have the obligation to the agency to support our policy, so that we will be charging for further no shows, except for, of course, extreme circumstances. So Charlie, does that sound okay to you? So that's my usual approach. However, this particular client missed a session again and didn't contact me. And sometimes, when someone misses a session, you make a judgment that